very much for coming today to this wonderful talk. My name is Craig Clark. I'm the president of the Portsmouth Historical Society. We're always happy to share our venue and all learn together in history, and really looking forward to that. I want to thank Tim Phelps for organizing this event and taking the lead. I also want to invite you that after the talk to really please take advantage of our on-staff docents and tour the museum below and our two outbuildings, which are fantastic. I know that Tim's going to talk about the actual structure of the church in some opening remarks. I also want to take the opportunity to talk about some upcoming events that you may be interested in. We're co-hosting an event with the Glen Manor House on August 16th. We're going to have a nice family event with the band. Our town historian Jim Garman is going to talk about the Glen Manor House and celebrate the 100th anniversary. That's Wednesday the 16th from 5 to 8 p.m. You can bring a lunch. We're going to have some food trucks there, and we hope to have a nice, casual, enjoyable time. Saturday, August 19th, we're co-hosting an event at the Butts Hill Fort. It's a rededication ceremony honoring Dr. Roderick Terry, who was the lead in restoring the fort over 100 years ago. We've made quite a bit of progress up there, and would love to show you all the progress we've made on our future plans for the fort, for Butts Hill Fort. Then we're hosting an event here on September 10th, a family event with some guided tours and living history portrayals. So we hope to have you all become members of the Historical Society and get informed and participate in our future together. And also, the flags up here are really interesting. This is one of our 13-star flags. We just had it evaluated to determine whether it was created or before, during the Revolutionary War, and a very unique 34-star flag, which is only produced for 2 years, I believe. So these will be on display after our talk as well. So without further ado, Tim Phelps. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks, Craig. Hello. As Craig said, I'm Tim Phelps, and I'm here today, Sunday, August 6, 2023, for the record, to bring together two of my favorite groups, the Portsmouth Historical Society and Channing Memorial Church in Newport. The Portsmouth Historical Society, founded in 1938, is dedicated to preserving the rich history of a town that goes back to 1638, a year before the founding of Newport, we'd like to point out. Exceedingly rare for the time, the town was founded by a woman, Anne Hutchinson, who had dared to preach and speak her mind to the Puritans in Boston, and for that was convicted of heresy and expelled in a snowstorm. She walked from Boston to Providence in a snowstorm, and she was heavily pregnant at the time. Not a few of the members of this society trace their families back to the early days because Portsmouth is a town with deep tradition. I want to thank Craig, the Society's president, as well as two of its other luminaries, Jim Gorman and Gloria Schmidt, for whose knowledge of William Ellery Channing's time in Portsmouth inspired and informed today's presentation. Channing Memorial Church on Turrell Park in downtown Newport goes back to 1835. In 1879, a new beautiful church was constructed and named after William Ellery Channing, a famous Unitarian minister who was born in Newport but spent his summers here in Portsmouth. Channing Church belongs to the Unitarian Universalist faith, brought together from two small faiths which broke off from the Puritan or Congregational Church in the early 19th century and combined in 1961. Unitarian Universalists believe in the inherent worth and dignity of all people and encourage spiritual growth without the boundaries of creed or doctrine. The church in which we sit today, the Christian Union Church, was founded in 1810. This building was constructed in 1865, replacing an earlier structure. I've just learned, actually, from Jim and Gloria that particularly in the early days, this congregation received funding from the Unitarian Church in Boston, or Newport. The congregation went into decline before World War II, and the building was donated to the Historical Society. Now, the reason we are here today is because William Ellery Channing preached to this congregation during summer-long vacations just down the road at Oakland Farm. For members of the Channing congregation or others who might be interested, summer services will be held starting next Sunday outdoors at Turo Park, when the theme is movement as a spiritual exercise. On August 20, Channing will host a self-guided walking meditation along the ocean from Ocean Drive. And on August 27th, life lessons from the Tao at the Parish Hall. After the presentation, we invite you to remain for tours. We'll be open for a couple of hours, as well as refreshments and hanging out. And also be sure and take a look at some of the outbuildings, especially the schoolhouse, which might possibly be the oldest schoolhouse in the state, and maybe the country. Now, our speaker today is the Reverend Bill Zelazny, a former town administrator who was called to the ministry in 1992. He has been Channing's able minister since 2016. Feel free to introduce yourself to Reverend Bill after his presentation if you have any questions. Our music, selected from Reverend Channing's era of the early 19th century, will be played by Connor Kennedy, who is foregoing the beginning of the Jazz Festival to be here with us today.
I call that mind free, which masters the senses, and which recognizes its own reality, which passes life, not in asking what it shall eat or drink, but in hungering, thirsting, and seeking after righteousness. I call that mind free, which jealously guards its intellectual rights and powers, which does not contend itself with a passive or hereditary faith, which opens itself to light whensoever it may come. I call that mind free, which discovers everywhere the radiant signature of the infinite Spirit, and in them finds its help to its own spiritual enlightenment. I call that mind free, which protects itself against the usurpations of society. I call that mind free, which does not mechanically copy the past, not live on its own virtues, but which listens for new and higher tones of the conscience. I call that mind free, which sets no bound to love, which recognizes in all human beings the image of God and the rights of God's children. So these are the words of the William Ellery Channing that's found in one of his sermons, and it sort of summarizes his life and his religious philosophy. So today, members of the Channing Memorial Church have come to the historic building to learn more about William Ellery Channing, the man for whom the Newport Unitarian Universalist Church is named. So Channing would often come to the non-denominational Christian church that was just down the street from him in the early 19th century on Sundays while he was vacationing on his family farm that is located nearby. And I was told he just sometimes preached, but more often just came to mingle and talk with neighbors about theology and about ethics and other more earthly matters, how the crops are doing and what the weather is like and all those kinds of things. Oh, I probably should say, so my sermon and material comes from some book learning, but I know I have people here who know a lot more about Channing and about this church, so that if I make mistakes a little bit later, you can stand up and correct me, okay? Kindly. So Channing was born on April 7, 1780 in Newport. His family was well known in the community. His grandfather, William Ellery, had been a signer of the Declaration of Independence, became a deputy governor of Rhode Island, and a state court justice. William Ellery Channing went to Harvard and graduated at the top of his class. So from there, he moved to Richmond, Virginia for 2 years, where he worked as a tutor for the David Meade Randolph family. It was during this time that he struggled with his theology. Now, he had been raised in a very conservative congregational church setting, which I'll talk about in the second part of my sermon, congregational church setting. But during his Richmond years, he came to oppose Calvinism. And he later wrote, he opposed Calvinism for proclaiming a God to be dreaded. We are told to love and imitate God, but also that God does things we would consider most cruel in any human parent. So he eventually came to hold a belief in a gentler, loving God who wanted humankind to be loving. This is the theology that he preached his life. So after Richmond, he returned to Harvard for a year to study theology to become a minister. In 1803, he was called to the Federal Street Church in Boston. Today it's known as the Arlington Street Church. He was called there in 1803 to be their minister, where he served for 39 years until his death in 1842. He drew large crowds to the church, which ultimately required that the building be expanded, that actually a new church be built to accommodate all of the people who wanted to hear him preach. I would love to have a church jammed like that. I think almost any church would love to have that. And we could probably find the money. So anyway, So we will hear a little portion of his sermon a little bit later, so you can get a sense of what it was like to hear him preach, what his words were. He had a fine turn of phrase, though the words are in the style is archaic to our ears. So in addition to his theological writings promoting liberal Christianity and supporting social justice causes, especially in opposition to slavery, he wrote poetry that literary and theological historians label as representing a proto or early transcendentalist perspective. That is, promoting the idea that men and women have knowledge about themselves and knowledge about the world around them that transcends or goes beyond what they can see, hear, feel, touch, or taste. See if you can hear the echo of transcendentalism in these poems. This is his 1810 poem, My Symphony. To live content with small means, to seek elegance rather than luxury, and refinement rather than fashion. To be worthy, not just respectable, and wealthy, not rich. To study hard, think quietly, talk gently, act frankly, to listen to stars, birds, babies, and stages with an open heart, and to bear all cheerfully, to do all bravely, await occasions, hurry never. In a word, to let the spiritual, unbidden, and unconscious grow up through the common. This is my symphony. And in his, from the same year, 1810 poem, Hymn of the Earth. My highway is unfettered air, unfeatured air. My consorts are the sleepless stars, and men my giant arms are bearing, my arms unstained and free from scars. I rest forever on my way, rolling around the happy sun. My children love the sunny day, but noon and night to me are as one. The forest and the mountains high, the foaming ocean and springs, the plains, oh, such pleasant company. My voice through all this rings. No leaf may fall, no pebble roll, no drop of water lost on the road. The issues of the general soul are mirrored in its round abode. So with such eloquent turn of the phrase, it's easy to understand why he became a popular speaker on ceremonial occasions and why his small church had to be rebuilt to accompany a congregation, as I understand at that time, of 900 people up in Boston. You all are welcome to come down to Channing Memorial Church and help fill our 400-seat congregation. So this is the man who we will think about this morning.
We have a reading from William Ellery Channing's Public Faith, written by Jack Mendelson. Channing bluntly raised his voice against the pervasive idolatry of his own time. Human nature has never shown itself so fiendish, he wrote, than when it was cloaked its bad passions under the garb of religion and let them loose. Let me say that again. Human nature has never shown itself so fiendish than when it has cloaked its bad passions under the garb of religion and let them loose. Religion, Channing said, was given to bind together, refine, soften human hearts. Its great ministry is that of love. To Channing, the spirit in liberal Christianity was a hunger for more freedom, more justice, more fairness, more inclusion, and more fulfillment for ever more people. He lifted his voice against slavery, strengthening the abolitionist cause. He supported Horace Mann's ideas for a revolutionary American approach to public education, Joseph Tuckerman's ideas for the creation of a new American profession, social work, among the victims of urban poverty, and some of the liveliest harbingers of early American feminism he also supported, including Elizabeth Peabody, a pioneer of early childhood education. Channing openly challenged the Calvinist conservatives of his time by writing, "I do and I must reverence human nature. I shut my eyes on none of its weaknesses and crimes, but injured, trampled on, and scorned as our nature is, I still turn to it with intense sympathy and strong hope. And I thank God that my own lot is bound up with that of the human race." In 1796, Oakland Farm, which some of us oldsters from Portsmouth remember was just a mile down the road, was purchased in 1796 by two prominent Newport merchants, George Gibbs and Walter Channing, who ran the firm of Gibbs and Channing, which, by the way, included the trade in enslaved Africans amongst its businesses. The most prominent member of the two families to take advantage of the country idol was the preacher, William Ellery Channing, who was 16 when Oakland was purchased. As Bill said, Channing was from a very prominent family. He would spend extended summers, often 4 or 5 months. I wish I had that kind of vacation, at Oakland. As if to make sure he would always have access, he married a member of the Gibbs family, his first cousin, Ruth Gibbs. Channing would spend summers at Oakland until he died in 1842. The Gibbs family sold the property in 1867 to New York financier and breeder of racehorses, August Belmont, and soon it was bought by Cornelius Vanderbilt II, becoming a grand estate with perhaps the largest indoor horse ring in the world. And by the way, I am stealing here from Jim Garman's book, Gentleman's Farms in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, which I believe we have for sale downstairs. But in Channing's day, there was just a simple country house, and the horses were likely not those of the fancy sort. Channing seemed to love this place more than anything in the world. "My residence," he wrote to a Miss Bailey, who lived on the Isle of Wight in the English Channel, "is in the very center of this beautiful island, 5 miles from the town. In natural beauty, my island does not seem to me inferior to yours. In cultivation, it will bear no comparison. Here I spend 4 or 5 months annually, enjoying my tranquility almost too much, almost reproaching myself for being so happy when I am doing so little for the happiness of others." Now, the Christian Union Church that eventually worshiped in this building was open to preachers of all sects, but to no one but Channing when he was available. It was so voted every year. Fishermen and farmers, as Bill said, made up the congregation, in which Channing took sincere delight. His preaching here was extemporaneous and of a simplicity which we are told was very beautiful, but there is no record of it remaining. It troubled Channing that it drew fashionable people from Newport to overhear it. Simple as it was, some of the ruder sort could not endure the strain and would go out, take a turn around the meeting house, and come back refreshed and ready for more, wrote Channing biographer John White Chadwick.
Should note that if you came up here and looked at it, there's probably no music on the music stand. That's all improv. While I, on the other hand, have every word, including every comma, written. So 200 years ago or so, the Reverend William Ellery Channing's name was widely known throughout New England and Europe. Not so much today. But 200 years ago, his essays, his articles, and books were widely read, including by Queen Victoria, and people packed, as I said earlier, into the Federal Street Church and any other lecture hall where he may be at. It was also interesting to hear that people would come, whatever, the 20-some miles in horse and carriage all the way up from Newport to hear him speak. So his preachings and writings strengthened liberal Protestant Christianity that in England had been bound up in strict Calvinist teachings that ultimately led to a new denomination being formed. I'll mention that in a moment. So now I've been using the terms before and now, Calvinist teachings and liberal Protestantism. So I probably should define what I mean by those terms. 18th century Calvinists and the Congregational Church that today is generally seen being on the far left side of the religious spectrum. At that time, though, the Congregationalist Church was Calvinist in its teaching, very strict Calvinist. It may even have made the Baptist Calvinists look like they were liberal. So the Calvinists taught that the Trinity of God. God is three persons in one God. The total depravity of humankind. Unconditional election. That is, that God chose whom he was to bring with him into heaven from all time, and it was not based on a person's virtue, merit, or faith. Jesus died as a substitution for humankind's sin. But interestingly, this substitutional atonement applied only to relieve the sins of those already saved. God's will could not be changed by anything that humans do. so that even if you prayed and fasted and went to church and were a nice person, if you had not been selected from the beginning of time, you weren't going to go to heaven. Which then leads to the final point that I want to make, that hell and eternal punishment was part of God's plan for humankind. So this is what Channing was challenging. He felt that the Calvinist theology about God suppressed people with fear and hopelessness. So rather, his message was based on what can be called liberal Christian theology, still used today, the term liberal Christian theology, which in general holds that Christian theology should be interpreted from the standpoint of modern knowledge and experience. Christianity is a movement of social reconstruction whose goal is to bring the kingdom of God to all people. Theology must be open to modern intellectual inquiry and ultimately to the authority of individual reason and experience. Historical accuracies of biblical facts or events are not crucial for belief, so long as the reader finds within the passages the message and the love of Jesus. True religion is the way of Christ, not any particular doctrine about Christ. So this liberal theology, Channing believed, uplifted the human spirit and guided people to love one another as God loved all people. So, and further, his belief also was that rather than absorbing or allowing oneself to be absorbed into God's spirit and making one some sort of automatron to God, humankind does not lose themselves as they become connected, more and more connected with God. Their soul ultimately is made freer because God, according to in his preaching, God is the infinite freedom of all existence, of all the universe. So it seems from Channing's writing and preaching that nothing could have been more dreadful to him than subjugating the wonder and the beauty of God's goodness and holiness by holding on blindly to a faith without having freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of feeling. So, in the early 19th century, a schism was developed in the Congregational Church between those who profess Orthodox Calvinism, Calvinist approach to Christianity, and those that held this more liberal interpretation of Scripture, the people who ultimately became known as Unitarians. With this personal philosophy and theology firmly anchored in liberal Christianity, in 1819, Channing accepted an invitation to preach at his friend Jared Sparks, at his ordination in Baltimore. And he used that to summarize what liberal religion would look like. In effect, what the Unitarians within the Congregational Church were starting to preach and believe. So, in 1819, May 5, 1819, he went to Baltimore. Think about going from Boston to Baltimore and back again. Also, it was interesting that I understand that a large delegation of maybe up to 20 people went from the Providence Unitarian Church down to Baltimore to hear him speak. Not to congratulate Jared Spark, but to hear Channing speak. So, what he was preaching, what he preached in this sermon sort of summarized, and was very radical for the time, very radical. Matter of fact, it was so radical that it hit the headlines of all the major newspapers up and down the East Coast. He gave a sermon about a very controversial theological perspective that sort of summarized the liberal movement within the Congregational Church. The sermon basically said that Scripture should be interpreted with a constant exercise of reason. The doctrine of the Trinity is unscriptural You cannot find the concept of the Trinity in the Bible. That is all human creation. Jesus Christ, though a holy person, in effect was later developed, was made holy by God at his resurrection. Jesus Christ, though a holy person, is a lesser being than God. Jesus Christ is not God. God's goodness is supreme, infinitely just, not unloving, cruel, and partial. The theology that Jesus died as a substitute for the infinite guilt of humankind is not scripturally based. He wrote, there is nothing that you could see in the Bible that talks about substitution. And virtue. Human virtue is found in the moral nature of humankind naturally, rather than something that is posed upon or required of humankind by an angry God. You can see why it was very controversial at that time. Why it's very controversial today. I think I heard a couple of groans when I made some comments about what the theology was. So it is around this perspective of God, Jesus, and the nature of humankind that the liberal wing of the Congregational Church coalesced into a religious movement that became the American Unitarian Church in the mid-1820s. This became one of the most significant denominations in New England and later throughout the United States. There were tens of thousands of Unitarians at that time. And I'm using Unitarian, even though our name now is Unitarian Universalist, because there was a merger of the two churches, as Tim mentioned. So this is why that a religious movement, a whole denomination, came out of Channing's teachings and preachings. This is why later religious leaders call Channing the father of American Unitarianism. So Channing was also known for his support of the temperance movement, the prison reform, and was an especially strong advocate for the anti-slavery movement. But his anti-slavery sentiment actually came late in life. Now, in his youth, Channing had been exposed to the institution of slavery. As we heard, his father's business transported slaves, and his family in Newport had owned a slave who, it seems, was able to purchase her freedom, or her husband purchased her freedom, before Channing was born, but she stayed with the family as their domestic servant, even though she became very famous as a baker and a cake maker. Channing's first real first-hand introduction to slavery occurred when he was working as a tutor down in Virginia to a slave-owning family, and what he saw disgusted him. Now, it also led him to come to the theology that slaveholders were as much damaged by the institution of slavery as were the enslaved people. But Channing was slow to speak out publicly against slavery. His position among the Boston elite, the fact that his Federal Street Church included many of Boston's most powerful industrialists who relied on the cheap Southern cotton, and the reality that he would be marginalized both in the church and the larger society if he was too public about his feelings, caused him to proceed very cautiously and primarily only talk about his opposition to slavery amongst close friends or people he could trust. But finally, in 1825, so this is 2 decades after he became minister of the Federal Street Church, he put his anti-slavery position into articles, primarily in religious journals. But it was interesting, he drew a very careful line between his opposition to slavery and the abolitionist movement that was considered to be the radicals, the very radicals at that time. They were probably the demonstrators and the Molotov cocktail throwers at that time, or at least considered to be. But over a few years, through his conversations with abolitionists author Lydia Marie Child, and with his friend, the Unitarian minister Samuel J. May, who was an abolitionist. He changed his mind, and in 1835, he published a book entitled Slavery, which launched his public advocacy for the gradual abolition of slavery. So Channing's liberal theology gave the foundation for his anti-slavery position. He argued that slaves have the same irrational nature and the same power of conscience as those who are not enslaved. And further, to him, slavery was a sin against God because it prevented both the slaves and the slave owners from following the ethical teachings of Jesus and perfecting their human nature. So, was interesting, as he had predicted, his strong advocacy for the abolition of the institution of slavery put him at odds with his church, and he finally withdrew from his church in 1840 and did not preach again until he died. That doesn't make sense because it almost sounds like he preached after he died. He withdrew from the church and did not preach, and then he died. So Channing died of typhoid fever on October 2nd, 1842, while visiting Old Bennington, Vermont. He is buried at the Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge. So you can see a statue, probably you've gone by it many times, down in Thoreau Park. It's across the street from the Channing Memorial Church. There's a statue of Channing sort of midlife. There's another statue like that up in Boston. So 40 years after his death, Channing was still an important personage in the pantheon of liberal Protestant theologians. On the centenary of his birth, there were speeches around the country and in Europe, in most major cities, here in the United States, as well as in London, Liverpool, Manchester, and Belfast. Also, as Tim said, in 1879, to mark the anniversary of his birth, Channing Memorial Church was built, the Unitarian Church was built on its current site and was finished in 1880, 1881. It's a beautiful building. If you haven't had an opportunity to actually go in and see it, come on down. As they would say in the game show. What is the game show? Price is Right. Come on down on Sunday when we're open. So I would like to wrap up my discourse using the 19th century term for a sermon, a discourse about Channing, reading just a very small portion of his sermon. I've selected his sermon, A Discourse on Spiritual Freedom, delivered May 26, 1830. And I selected this because the theme is still relevant today. Now, the language is archaic by our standards, but it's eloquent and meaningful. I do want to say that Tim talked about the people not being able to necessarily take the sermon and would get up and walk around the church, probably go out and have a smoke or whatever. That's because most of these sermons were 45 minutes to an hour and a half. I don't have the energy to write something like that. Okay, so the text that he used for this sermon is John 8. If ye continue in my word, then ye are my disciples indeed, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. If you read sermons of this era, you will always find one sentence, just even a part of a biblical passage that sort of sets the tone for what the sermon's about, what the next 45 or 90 minutes is going to be about. So, Jesus speaks of himself as giving freedom. This is Channing. Jesus speaks of himself as giving freedom, that great good of individuals and states. That will be the chief topic of my present discourse. I shall maintain that the highest interest of communities as well as individuals is a spiritual interest, that outward and earthly goods are of little worth, but as beating upon the mind. Now I am fully aware that in taking that course I lay myself open to objection. I shall be told that I show my ignorance of human nature in attempting to interest men, I'm using again the term of that time, meant by such refined views of society. That spiritual liberty is too unsubstantial and visionary as to end up in legislation. That gross and tangible realities can alone move the multitudes. Oh, I anticipate such objections, but they do not move me. I firmly believe that the only truth which is to do man any lasting good is that which relates to the soul, which carries them into its depths and reveals to them its power and purpose of creation. Spiritual liberty. Now, to him, spiritual liberty was the idea of trying to live a sin-free life. Even though he did not believe in predestination, he wanted people to live a sin-free life. So, in conclusion, Channing, I've not gone 90 minutes yet, have I? Channing was a brilliant man. He was not without his flaws, but he was recognized widely as a true religious and spiritual leader. And through his 40-plus years of ministry, he asked the people of his time, and he asks us today to open our minds and our hearts to the wonders and the mystery and the divine love that sustains us all. So be it. So I misplaced my program. So I think we have a question and answer.
Yes, neither of us claims to be experts on Mr. Channing, but we would be glad to take your questions, and maybe we can get some help from Corey or Jim.
Yeah. And also, if you have any questions about the religion that ultimately came out of what he was doing, that's where I may be the expert. Okay, I see two questions over here.
You said he was born in 1780, but our church has 1779 on this.
That's when they laid the cornerstone was laid on the 100th anniversary. But all of my books.
There's a difference between 79 and 80, I guess.
Yes. I'm going by what the books tell me. He was born in 1880. 1780. I'll have to check that. I have actually never looked at that at the church.
If I did the arithmetic right, Channing never actually entered this building. It was built after he died.
Correct.
Is the building, the original building, still standing down
No.
there?
It was, Corey, it was on this site, was it not?
It was on this site, and then it was moved. And Jim, there's a picture up there where we think shows it as a barn on a farm that kind of had a corner through there. In those days, they didn't demolish buildings. They made use of them. So it was kind of auctioned off when they built this building. But he came and preached and worked with the same congregation.
Okay.
It's not the same building, but it's the same congregation.
Jim, this is Jim Corey.
It was moved out beyond Sandy Point Avenue to the Sisson Farm there. And we do have, I uncovered one photograph of it, which is in that case up front. And it is a church, but it has a big ramp in the front where they brought the wagons in and so on afterwards. It was there until I finally disintegrated in 1906.
Yes.
What about Channing's summer house? It must have been a grand thing since his wife was Gibbs, but is there any trace of it left? Does it exist?
Jim, do you want to address that?
So I had a hard time hearing.
The question was, what about Channing's house? Is there, Eleanor said it must have been a grand house. I'm not sure that's true. And there was any trace of it
No, Oakland Farms was a small farmhouse when he was there, but a lot of land, tremendous amount of land. It later was purchased and eventually fell into the Vanderbilt family, and William Vanderbilt, Alfred Gwynn had it. He died in the Lusitania, and William Vanderbilt got it. He lived there. He was born there. He lived from 1901 to 1976. And he was on that farm, which was the house was much expanded, with big southern colonial pillars in front of it and everything. It was really much larger until the 1970s or so, when the family had left. William Vanderbilt went out to Western Massachusetts and ran a general store, which is kind of interesting for Vanderbilt. And eventually it was purchased and it was divided up into house lots for condominiums, which is what it is now. A number of people on the historical society and in the town, including myself, saved one chunk of Oakland Forest over here. And one of the people that we had helped save it was William Vanderbilt's daughter, who at that time lived up in Brookline. And, but we do have one natural forest across the street, just west a little bit. And that's a really special place. Except some of the trees are dying out. We're having a really serious problem with the trees in there right now. Anyway, everything from Union Street down to St. Mary's Church. Also, on the other side of Union Street, up this way, where they have some of the barns, and all the way halfway down Union Street. It was a huge farm. It was probably about 400 or 500 acres altogether. And that was one of 3 gentleman farms in this area. Alfred Wynn's brother Reginald had Sandy Point Farm, and then the Taylor family had Glen Farm over this way. This whole area was gentleman farms.
And as a personal postscript, my father's second farm, where I was born and lived for 6 years, was a piece of Oakland Farm on Sandy Point Road, where Jim lives now, on the east side of Sandy Point Road. And then we moved to another section of former Oakland Farm on Middle Road, where I live today.
Question or correction?
No, just another thing to add to that. When he would come out, Sarah Gibbs, who was the aunt, right? He would live with her. Now, she donated and built St. Mary's Episcopal. So you can imagine what that household was like, because you had William Ellery Channing there, you know, in the summer, and Sarah Gibbs, who was very Episcopal oriented, and she built a church in the same household.
Well, it's been interesting to get her conversations. Yes, because from my readings, I understand that Channing really loved talking about theology and all of that. Again, I guess that's where I get his spirit infests me, because I like talking about this kind of stuff. Yes.
Can you speak about his relationship with Transcendentalism, Thoreau, and Emerson?
Okay. He was before this, so that's why I use the term proto-transcendentalist with his poems. He's identified as having some of the thoughts and the philosophies that came in, developed into eventually Transcendentalism. So Transcendentalism with Emerson and Thoreau and others, Fuller was sort of a religious movement. Actually, was an anti-Unitarian movement. Yeah, because the thoughts were with some people is that even though Unitarianism had freed itself from Calvinism, it had developed, and this happens probably with most religions, it had developed into too formal of a structure. And so the Transcendentalists believed much more in an open way of understanding God, understanding the universe, of living in the universe. So Transcendentalism developed as an anti-Unitarian religious movement, but very shortly actually moved into and became a philosophical and literary movement, almost completely divorced from religion, probably within 10 years or so after that. Other?
I wondered if you could comment a little bit about this notion of the elect among the Calvinists, because certainly when Channing first started out in his first church, there must have been plenty of people who identified themselves as being among the elect. And what were the criteria? How did people identify themselves as being privileged?
By their wealth. Actually, you did not know whether you, from all time, had been selected to be with God when you died. So that was the big secret, and that's why everyone lived in fear. And if you read any of the materials about like our pilgrim and our Puritan ancestors here, and what they preached in their church. Remember the sermon of the angry God. The God was always angry, hated us, hated his creation. So the idea was that you were elected. God elected some number of people from all time to be in heaven with God when you died and at the end of time. How did you know? You did not know. So the idea was you were supposed to live a good life to sort of thank God for maybe electing you. I want to see the money. So it was also then that's where the very early ideas of the prosperity gospels developed. Is that obviously if you were elect and you were going to spend time with God, God was bestowing his, I use the word his, not theology mind, but his grace on you by allowing you to be wealthy here. And that's also then, the other part is that you had a choice whether you wanted to share that wealth, or because God had given you that wealth, you could keep that wealth for yourself. So that's why that was sort of the beginning of the development of what we now call the robber barons. They didn't have to share their wealth with anyone because God had given them that. Sense of the question about elect? Yeah. I don't like commenting about other people's religion, but that theology is a hateful theology. Other than that, I have no opinion on it.
One more item of trivia, as far as this church is concerned, is that Julia Ward Howe preached in this church often. And she had a summer home down the other end of Union Street. And she was here quite a bit until, as a summer house, she lived in Boston mostly. But she was here until she died in 1905. So in the 1880s, 1870s, when she was a really hard-charging reformer involved in the women's liberation movement and so on, she preached in this church, as it is now.
And those of you from Channing Memorial Church know that in the very first pew right here is marked her seat. So when she was down visiting, coming down to Providence, Prime Minister came down from Providence, came down from Boston to Newport, she sat right here. So it's interesting. I can imagine the ministers at that time. See, yeah, we think Channing may have actually, well, not our current church, but the prior church, may have actually been there. And Howe came here, and Lafarge was there, so I can imagine the minister standing up there. I have to admit, I've had occasion where I've had, very, luminaries, philosophical or religious luminaries, sitting in the congregation, and double check my notes, and still made mistakes. So, because it was correct. I had a philosophical philosopher who wrote several books, and I made the mistake of including some of the philosophical thoughts at the time that he taught. And after the sermon, he would come up and he would say, "That was a nice sermon. I'd like to hear you talk, but that was awful." Thank you for the confidence for a brand new minister.
And by the way, we have a small exhibit downstairs on Julia Ward Howe. So check it out.
Yes.
What was the name of the famous free black baker woman who raised William? And did he ever write about her?
Queen, let's see, what was her name? Duchess, what's that?
Is it Quamino?
Something like that, yes, Duchess, yeah. So she became, she actually ran her bakery out of the Channing house, and her food and especially her cakes were sought after by the very wealthy of the town, even at that time. This was before the summer homes were built. But yeah, she was very
Did you
well.
ever write about it?
Huh?
In his writings? Do we have?
No, I have, other than a little caption. Mrs. Victoria Johnson from the in Newport gave a talk about her a few years ago on that as part of Black History Month on that. But there are books or passages about her. I had a question here.
Did people ever tell you that you look like Owen Powell?
I'm sorry, I didn't do that.
Said you look like Colin Powell.
Thank you. I did at one time think about going into Mildred's career. I served 3 years in the Army, and I thought, oh, maybe I could do this. Unfortunately, I decided that I wanted to live longer than the 2 minutes that second lieutenants lived when they went to Vietnam, so I didn't do that. We've had this, I'm sorry, I'll have one more question. And then
Do you know, have any idea why he went to Richmond or why he went to Virginia?
why?
Yes.
He went down there to be a tutor.
But what sparked that? Do you know, was there a family member?
Yeah, there was family, and I could look at it. Yeah, he went down there to be the private tutor of this very wealthy slave-owning family in Richmond. And he was there for 2 years, and that's when he ultimately felt the call to come back to go to Harvard for 1 more year and get his doctorate at that time, his DD, at that time, and then become a minister.
Thanks.
Oh,
Shoot, go ahead.
that period that you mentioned interested me too as you were talking about it. And I seem to remember, maybe incorrectly, that William Ellery Channing was quite ill when he was in Virginia. And I found it kind of interesting that he said that his strongest ideas about abolition kind of came out of that period, and then this inspiration to go back to Harvard. So if I'm right,
Yes.
he's down there really, suffering in illness, and he's
What I read is that he left Boston here as this kind of strong, strapping man, got sick down there, came back as a very weak, relatively infirm person. His preaching voice moved from booming to very quiet, so you can imagine sitting in 900 people. The hearing horns, which I use now, what I use now, the hearing horns. So his last part of his life, or last many years, 40 years of his life, he basically was a invalid person. He wasn't a strong individual. Okay. So I have enjoyed this a lot. I hope you all have. We are going to wrap up with another wonderful piece of music that Connor's going to play for us. And then, as Tim said, there's a display downstairs that let's all go down and take a look at the history of the area here. Connor.